Hey there! In this video, I'm going to be talking about the low light or high ISO performance of the Nikon Z8, and I'll be comparing that with the Canon R5C. And whenever I make these low light tests, I do like to compare cameras with other cameras to see how they stack up against each other. And I think the R5C is a great comparison because these cameras are very similar in terms of the specifications and the price. But before we get into the video, I just have to have a huge thank you to B&H Photo, who lent me the Nikon Z8 to test, review, and make videos like this for all of you. So if you're looking to pick up some camera gear, go check out B&H. That's where I buy most of my stuff from. There are links in the description for the Z8 and also all the gear that I use on a regular basis. Now, every time I make these videos, I end up spending way too much time doing deep dives into the camera and a lot of research, and this video is no exception. So there will be some extra information in this video about how to expose N-Log, noise reduction in the Z8, and also the different recording formats in the Z8. Okay, let's start off by talking about how to properly expose N-Log. Now, this was really tricky to find this information, so because I did this research, I want to share it with all of you. The first place I looked, of course, was the Z8 manual, and it actually didn't specify proper exposure for middle gray. Now, when I am doing these technical tests, or if I'm shooting in a controlled environment, I try to get the proper exposure for middle gray based on whatever the camera manufacturer says. So it wasn't in the manual. I went and found the white paper. If you don't know what a white paper is, a lot of these manufacturers will produce technical documents that they'll share online about different cameras or different log curves and stuff like that. And in the white paper for N-Log, it does have a graph and it does have all the equations and stuff, but it doesn't give you a % IRE for middle gray. So I did some more Googling and I found that in a Z6.2 and Z7.2 document that it listed 35% IRE. Now I figured that 35% IRE would be the standard exposure for middle gray in N-Log and all the cameras, because with other manufacturers, if you're shooting S-Log3 or C-Log2 or whatever, it's kind of the same between all the cameras for proper exposure. But what I did just to confirm is I reached out to my sources at Nikon and they confirmed 35% IRE. So the Nikon Z8 does not have false color. So the next best thing you can use in a camera is going to be zebras, which I recommend in most cameras. Getting proper exposure on a great card is using zebras. So one thing that was extra tricky about not just finding the information, but the fact that the zebras in the Z8 are on a scale from 0 to 255, not percentage IRE, which is super weird. 0 to 255 is a scale of 256, which is an 8-bit color scale. I don't get it why it's not percentage IRE, but I had to reach out to Nikon and find out that we need to set the zebras to 95 in the Z8 for exposing middle gray in N-Log. So let me show you some stuff in the camera about this. So if we go into the custom settings menu and we go to video and we go to G13, the zebra pattern, you have a few different options in here. So the pattern tone range, you have 3 different options. Off would be zebras off, midtones would be for the settings for the midtones, and the highlights, we're gonna be looking for midtones here, so we're gonna select that. The pattern, you can go left to right or right to left. And then the highlight threshold will be if you set it to the highlight settings, but we're not going to be using that. We're going to be using the mid-tone range. And like I said, 95 with ±5 is the number that we're looking for to get proper exposure for N-Log in the Z8. And of course, the Canon R5C makes it super easy. I can just use false color to get proper exposure for middle gray. Now for this test, and for most of the time I compare cameras, I like to use the same lens on both cameras. So I use my trusty Sigma 28mm lens, and I have the proper adapters here. And if you haven't watched these tests before, I set the exposure based on the proper exposure for middle gray using the shutter speed at 1/50 and the ISO at 800. And then all that I do is I raise the ISO by 1/3 of a stop and increase the shutter by 1/3 of a stop. That way I am maintaining proper exposure at every ISO value. And then I can go through the ISO range and compare the cameras. So I actually edit in Final Cut Pro, and I decided to edit this whole project in DaVinci Resolve, which I am not super comfortable with. And the reason for that is that I really want to take a look at NRAW, because if I didn't, I don't think that would be a fair comparison with the Nikon Z8. Now, at the time of recording this, NRAW is only supported in DaVinci Resolve, so had to use Resolve. Now, when I was comparing these images, I didn't really try to match the images perfectly in terms of colors. I will take a look at image quality and color in a later video. What I did do was use the technical conversions in the raw section of Resolve's color grading page and also color space transforms. Again, trying to do this by the book and do it as technically as possible. But again, the images won't match perfectly, but what I want to make sure that you're looking at is the noise performance in terms of both luma and chroma noise, and sort of see how the colors hold up in the high ISO range. In terms of recording formats in the Z8, we have a few different options. We have the NRAW 12-bit, which we'll definitely be testing out, and I did test this out in the high setting. We also have ProRes RAW HQ 12-bit, which I'm not going to be testing in this video because I had to pick either NRAW or ProRes RAW because I'm editing in DaVinci. I can only use the NRAW. I think that was better for this video. We also have the ProRes 422HQ 10-bit, which I will be testing, and also the H.265 10-bit, which I will also be testing. There are a few 8-bit options here as well, but I won't be covering that in this video. So in the R5C, I have a couple different recording options. We'll be using the RAW ST, which is the 8192 by 4320, which will compare really nicely with the 8.3K NRAW. And also, I'll be using the XF-AVC 422 10-bit option in DCI, and I think that will be a really good comparison with the H.265 10-bit option in the Z8. Okay, so let's jump into the comparisons. And for the first one, I want to test the Nikon Z8 in the 8.3K NRAW against the R5C in the 8.2K RAW ST. Now, when I do these tests, I always record all of the ISO range, so if there's anything in the lower ISO range, it will stand out. Now, I think in the low ISO, it's pretty similar between the two cameras, maybe a slight advantage to the Z8. Now, at 3200, the Canon R5C does kick into its second base ISO, and at 4000, I definitely see a little bit of cleaning up in the Z8, so maybe some sort of informal second base ISO. At 5000, the Z8 may be a little bit less chroma noise. At 6400 and up, though, I think they're pretty similar. The one thing that I noticed as a difference between the two is in the chroma noise. The chroma noise is just like maybe a little bit more red in the R5C and maybe a little bit more green in the Z8. But the colors hold pretty well in the high ISO range, and I think both cameras perform fairly similarly up to 25,600. So before we get on to the rest of the examples and comparisons, I need to take a moment to talk about noise reduction. So this is not defined properly in the Z8 manual. So of course I reached out to Nikon for clarification. Now the two RAW formats, the NRAW and the ProRes RAW, have zero noise reduction applied, which makes complete sense because they are RAW formats, and this was confirmed by Nikon. Now the two other formats which I'm testing in this video, the ProRes and the H.265, there is noise reduction applied, but it does it automatically and the level cannot be controlled. So this was a little bit confusing, so let me show you in the camera. So I currently have NRAW selected, and if I scroll down just a little bit to the high ISO noise reduction, you can see that it's grayed out, and when I click it, this option is not available at the current settings or in the camera's current state. So you can't select the noise reduction settings in NRAW, which makes complete sense, but it's actually turned off when you're in the RAW modes. So if I go here and I select, let's say H.265 or the ProRes 422HQ, again, when I go down to the high ISO noise reduction setting, it is grayed out and I cannot change it. The one way that you can change the ISO, high ISO noise reduction settings is if you go to either the H.265 10-bit and change it from N-Log to SDR. Now you can go down here to the high ISO noise reduction settings and you can change it from off to low to normal to high. You can also do this if you are setting it to either of the 8-bit modes. So just keep in mind that if you're using ProRes, not ProRes RAW, or the H.265 in N-Log, then it is applying some noise reduction automatically and we have no way to control that, the levels being applied or how it works or any of that kind of stuff. So in the R5C, if you're not in a RAW recording mode, you can change the noise reduction settings however you want. I made a detailed video about this, and I'll leave that video linked down below if you want to check it out. But I am here in the XF-AVC, and if I go over to recording in C-Log3 and edit this, I can go down here and change the noise reduction settings, but I have it on automatic because that's how it comes as default, and I figured that would be a fair way to compare it with the automatic noise reduction settings in the Nikon Z8 in the compressed codecs. Now let's get back to the comparisons, and you'll definitely see right away in this example that there's some noise reduction happening here, even at the lower ISOs. Now, when you're recording in these modes, these are oversampled from the 8K from the full sensor, and when you oversample from, let's say, 8K to 4K, you definitely compress some of the noise and it looks cleaner. But also keep in mind that when I was recording the 8K RAW, I was putting this in a 4K timeline, so you're still getting that oversampling in the editor. So the cleaning up of this definitely has to do with the noise reduction. So taking a look here at the Nikon Z8's H.265 10-bit in N-Log against the Canon R5C's XF-AVC All-I in C-Log3, even at the lower ISOs here, you can definitely see some noise reduction happening. There's definitely cleaner than the RAW recordings. So just like before, we see some cleaning up of the R5C at 3200 when it hits its second base ISO. We also see some cleaning up at 4,000 on the Z8, but I think the R5C is definitely cleaner. From 5,000 and up, the R5C is cleaner both in terms of chroma and luminoise, and this may have to do with the noise reduction settings, but because when we looked at the RAW, they were pretty similar. Once you get up into the higher ISO range, coming up to, let's say, 16,000, the chroma noise starts to really kick in with the R5C, but there's definitely a slight edge to the R5C here in terms of the super high ISO range, and I have to chalk that up a lot to the noise reduction. Now that we took a look at comparing the R5C with the Z8, let's take a look and compare some of the stuff just inside of the Z8. So here we have the NRAW on the left and the ProRes 422 HQ on the right. Now, I don't know if this comes through on YouTube, but to me, and what I'm looking at my screen, the noise pattern looks very different between the two. It looks a lot finer in the RAW, and it looks a lot blockier and smearier on the ProRes. Of course, that's from the noise reduction. The colors do look similar in both at the higher ISO range, and the zoomed in parts on the color checker, I think it appears to be a pretty extreme difference because we're zoomed in to 600% to show that. But if you look at the actual image, like the noise on my face, and again, not sure if this is gonna come through on YouTube, there's really only a slight difference in performance here, and I think you'd be fine using the RAW and maybe applying a little bit of noise reduction, but a little bit of a cleaner image with the ProRes. Next, we have the NRAW versus the H.265 10-bit, and you can see both sort of cleaning up at 4,000 there like they did before. Now, when I'm comparing these, I think we're getting very similar results as we did with the NRAW versus the ProRes HQ mode, and I think that that really chalks up to the fact that the noise reduction is being applied fairly similar in the ProRes as it is in the H.265. So I don't really see too much of a difference there, even going up into the higher ISO range between the H.265 and the ProRes. So let's take a look and compare those two. So here we have the H.265 on the left and the ProRes on the right. And even up into the higher ISO range, these two look really similar in terms of the noise performance and colors and all that sort of stuff here. They look very, very similar. I think that maybe the H.265 has a little bit less chroma noise once you get up into the super high ISO range, but really it's subtle, and maybe that has to do with the extra compression in the H.265 codec. Not really sure, but pretty similar here. So overall, strong performance by both cameras, and it's really easy to pixel peep real hard when I'm zoomed in 600% on those dark chips on the color checker. But looking at the images, overall, they look really good on both cameras. Now, the R5C is not known to be a great high ISO performer, but I've tested it against other cameras, and I'll leave those videos linked down below. And in my opinion, the R5C is very strong in that middle ISO range, which is personally just more important to me than that super high ISO range like on the FX3 and A7S3, which have that second base at 12,800. I find having a really clean middle to middle high ISO range just a lot more beneficial to me in my work, and it seems like both these cameras kind of do that. The Nikon Z8 can hold its own, like I said, in that medium to medium high ISO range. Now, of course, for ultimate control with noise, shoot in RAW and then apply noise reduction in post. Now, personally, I generally shoot a 10-bit compressed codec in all the cameras that I use, but I do wish that Nikon would let you change the noise reduction settings in those compressed codecs like Canon does in the R5C. Overall, impressed by the Nikon Z8. It's kind of what I expected, but it performed pretty well. If you enjoyed this video and found value in it, please hit subscribe down below. It'd be greatly appreciated. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.